Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Lecture 10. We are covering the practices and history of art history. This is the pair of lectures I'm posting up for while I'm traveling to the ceramics convention. This one in specific, this is going to be short, but also there's no pictures in this one. We are just doing an overview of the history of art history. I think that pretty much covers it. All right, so let's begin. Okay, so art history, what is it? Art history is a discipline that investigates visual art, its creators, its contexts, and its impacts. It's an academic field and combines elements of history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and aesthetics to analyze artworks and understand their significance. This lecture is going to provide an overview of the history and methodologies of art history, highlighting its evolution as a field and the practices that define it today. And remember, keep an eye on those underlined sentences as we're going through this. All right, so first we're going to cover the philosophical foundations and early contributions to art history. And like most things, it's going to start with Plato. Well, most things in the West, right? So Plato contributed foundational ideas about art, particularly in his critique of mimesis. We've talked about this earlier in the semester. Mimesis is the copying of reality, the representation of reality as it exists visually, right? So that is art as an imitation of reality. So that mimesis, you got to keep in mind that the term art didn't exist for the ancient Greeks, not as we use it today. It was closer, I believe, to technica, what we would think of as craft. So Plato viewed art as an imitation of reality and questioned its ability to convey truth. For Plato, art had a dual role. It could educate and inspire morality, but it also risked misleading people by presenting illusions. Another ancient contribution was by Pliny the Elder in his text Natural History, which provided biographical accounts of artists and some of his early reflections on art's role in society. So Pliny the Elder, what are we talking about? Like right around the turn of the millennium, right? Because this is Rome. I believe he was writing under one of the early Caesars, Julius Augustus, one of them. Probably should have put that in there. Vitruvius, we've also talked about him. This is in one of my tangents on Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, right? And this one was under Julius Caesar when he wrote this. So somewhere around 30 AD. Probably should have put dates in this. Something to do next time. So De Architectura, I believe, again, I mentioned this. There's several books in this series on architecture that he wrote, and no pictures anywhere in the book. So he just described architecture. And so in that, he outlined the principles of symmetry and proportion in architecture, which influenced later aesthetic theories. And these principles, as most things with ancient Rome, were based on the Greek precedents. So he's also talking about the proportions and symmetry that was present in ancient Greek art. That's where the Vitruvian Man, the guy outlined in a circle and a square, that one, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so now quite a leap. We're going like 1,500 years into the future to the Renaissance, the Renaissance revival and the systemization of art history. So, for most people in the West, Giorgio Vasari is considered the first art historian. So, kind of in general, the Renaissance revived interest in classical antiquity, that being, again, Greco-Roman, Greek and Roman. Giorgio Vasari's book, entitled The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which was written in 1550, marked the beginning of systematic art historical writing. This was the beginning of it, and it's just biographies and him kind of being a bit of a sycophant towards Michelangelo. I don't think a lot has changed, But anyways, Vasari started it. And so in his book, he celebrated artistic progress and individual genius, emphasizing the connection between technical skill and intellectual virtue. And this individual genius thing, it still kind of plagues art history, right? Because yes, we love hero worship, we love our individual geniuses, but they're always part of a movement, a community, a culture, right? They're shaped by their surroundings. So certainly some people stand out, but they couldn't really stand out without the context which created them. All right. So also during the Renaissance, patronage was really important. So patronage during the Renaissance, notably by families like the Medici, like most of Florence was just like advertising for the Medici. This patronage shaped artistic production and underscored art's cultural and political significance. Right, it's kind of in the Renaissance is where we see a lot of the way that art functions in the contemporary world, modern world. It all starts with the Renaissance. Moving on, again, a bit of a time jump here, a couple hundred years. Now we're in the Enlightenment, and we're looking at aesthetic philosophy. So a couple hundred years in the future, we've got Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, which was written in 1757. And here, this book distinguished the beautiful, which was associated with harmony and pleasure, from the sublime, which was linked to vastness and awe. And this description actually isn't the most accurate. Harmony is kind of like an underlying facet of nature, right? This is linked to mathematics, order, the word cosmos, meaning order. The beautiful is kind of, it's pleasure, but it's also things that are small and delicate. It's feminine. Whereas the sublime is grand, awe-inspiring. It's vast, but it's also masculine. And it's in that separation and the association of gendered terms, which of course is part of ancient language, like in Latin, things are masculine or feminine. But it's that association that has made the term beautiful problematic for art in the contemporary world. So it's something that people are trying to disentangle, but these are still very useful terms and concepts for communicating about art. So, moving on, Immanuel Kant. Pretty much everything, any intellectual conversation in the modern era in some way is going to go back to Kant. Kant's name is going to come up. So in his Critique of Judgment, written in 1790, he expanded on these concepts. And so he saw the sublime as an experience that transcended sensory perception, revealing profound truths about human existence and the natural world. So, again, a little jump in time to the 19th and 20th century. Art history becomes an institution. It's formalized. It's institutionalized, if you will. So, Johann Joachim Winckelmann is a really important figure, and he's typically associated with neoclassicism. So in his book, The History of Ancient Art, he laid the foundation for stylistic and cultural analysis of classical antiquities. His emphasis on noble simplicity and quiet grandeur influenced the study of Greek and Roman art. So this is almost like a second Renaissance. Everybody's looking back and, man, those Greeks and those Romans were really onto something. And when I'm thinking about like this era of 19th and 20th century kind of archaeologists, historians, these Western trained going and finding like the secrets of the ancient world, I can't help but think of Indiana Jones. And this is kind of where it all starts. So Heinrich Wölfflin, really important. I think about Wölfflin often in my analysis of art. So he wrote a book, The Principles of Art History, in 1915, which introduced visual categories such as linear versus painterly and planar versus recessional, which provided a systematic method for analyzing stylistic differences, particularly between the Renaissance and Baroque period, which, from a contemporary standpoint, looking back to Renaissance and Baroque, they're very similar. It's really just that dramatic lighting, in the most simplistic level. It's the lighting that's so different, and of course, culturally, it was very different because you're dealing with the Reformation, Counter-Reformation schism of the Catholic Church. I'm sure for people at the time, it was dramatically different, and those differences have become less and less. Looking back through the lens of history. And so even in 1915, Wölfflin saw them as dramatically different enough to write an entire book about it. But what's important here is that he gives us a very useful framework for looking at just the formal qualities of art. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about formalism, and Wölfflin's language is something that we can use for that formal discussion. Also, really what we've talked about this entire class with the elements and the principles of art, principles of composition. Those are formal concepts, and it's within those, like looking at rhythm and movement and emphasis and color and all of these different things. Those are formal categories that we can use for an initial base level interpretation of a work of art. Before we get into the historic cultural context, we can just look at the thing itself and ask, what color is it? How big is it? Is it heavy? Is it light? All these things, right? The conversation starts there. We don't need to be super complicated about it. All right. So moving on, we have iconography and iconology. This is one that I actually reread recently for class. Panofsky, really interesting, right? This is where we get to be, I'm like partly a kid looking at a highlights magazine, pulling out all the hidden images, and partly like looking at it like a detective, right? And Sherlock Holmesing this thing, trying to find out all the secrets. It's when we looked at Hans Holbein's Ambassadors, right? And Holbein, yeah, that's how it is, the Ambassadors. And you're looking at all these things, and it's like, why is all this stuff here, and what do they mean, right? So that's where we have scholars like Abby Warburg and Erwin Panofsky advancing iconography, which is an analysis of the symbols and themes within a work of art. So Panofsky has 3 tiers, which is pre-iconographical, iconographical, and iconological. And these became essential to understanding the deeper cultural and historical significance of artworks, right? Because by looking at these elements, these motifs and themes within the work of art, you can see what's important to those people in that time, and you can start to interpret what the function, the use, both in like daily life, but also what did these things symbolize, you know? So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Think of that painting, The Ambassador, when you think of iconography and iconology. All right. So Warburg's work then emphasized the transmission of visual motifs across time and space, which broadened art history's scope to include cross-cultural and interdisciplinary studies. And this is really where we are now in art, is this kind of cross-cultural conversations. As we live in a global world, cultures are constantly abutting up against one another. And it's in those transition zones between cultures, the conversations across culture, where all the interesting conversations and artworks seem to be happening and being made. All right, so now we move into modernist approaches and formalist theories. So Clive Bell, significant form. This is pretty important. I love that Clive Bell just calls his book art, right? Very... What would you say? Very creative? Yeah, very creative, Clive. All right, so that was written in 1914, and it introduced the concept of significant form, which focused on the formal qualities of art, such as line, color, and composition. And he saw these as the primary sources of aesthetic experience. He argued that the power of art lay in its ability to evoke an emotional response through these formal elements, independent of the narrative or representational content. His approach laid the groundwork for modernist movements that emphasized abstraction and formal innovation. So 1914, this shows up again, like you'll read it in Vasily Kandinsky. And so when you think about this, this is pretty important, right? Because up until this point, before art was kind of liberated through the invention of photography, painters had to recreate reality. I mean, they didn't have to, but they were often asked to, and they were trained to. And so to say that it doesn't matter what it's a painting of, but how it's painted, right? What are the lines? What are the colors? How is it composed? And these very basic layers that have nothing to do with what is being represented, to say that the meaning comes from there, empowers artists to not have to paint reality, but to paint these fundamental abstractions that reality is based on. So again, think here, you see a mountain, but no, you make a triangle, right? A building is just a rectangle, and so you can simplify down to these base elements and still convey emotions to the viewers. That was a revelation for people in the early 20th century, and I think we're still kind of having that conversation, and people still struggle with it. We still want things in art, and yet sometimes it's a lot more poignant when the things are gone and you're able to just feel these fundamental abstractions that create reality, right? Cool stuff. All right, so Roger Fry expands this idea and emphasizes the transformative power of art through its formal qualities. So, as a critic and curator, Fry championed the post-impressionists and advocated for an art that prioritized the emotional resonance over the literal representation. So again, post-impressionism, you're looking at like Van Gogh, Matisse, impressionism being like, Monet, Renoir, Degas. We had that conversation recently about all the ballerina paintings, right? There's still a lot of things in there. And as you start moving on, Cézanne's kind of this transitional figure that is both impressionist, post-impressionist. But anyways, the things become less important and the way it's painted becomes more important. And then that moves into full abstraction. Even though full abstraction was already being created at this time, it wasn't fully embraced yet. All right, so now we're looking at the modernist approaches and formalist theories. So we're going to get into these in much more detail in the next lecture, and I'm really going to get into the methodology of art historical criticism, and we're going to look at specific works of art. It's going to be a lot of talking. It's a long presentation, but hopefully it'll be interesting. So comparative and cross-cultural studies, again, this is kind of still where we are in the 21st century. So the early 20th century saw a growing interest in studying art from diverse cultural contexts. This approach involved comparing artistic traditions from different regions to identify shared influences and unique developments. Scholars began to challenge Eurocentric narratives, incorporating non-Western art into broader art historical discussions. So we aren't talking about the monoculture, the main culture, the dominant culture, but how different cultures have influenced one another. Right, so it's not just the Western world, but the conversation between East, West, how colonialism and interactions with Africa have also shaped the West. Where even does the line between East and West exist? It's really easy to discuss things when you just draw these kind of like hard and fast definitions, and you just talk about European art and European art as created as this independent extension of European culture and this dominant culture. But that's a false version of history. Europe isn't the only thing, and certainly there was a lot of trade going on. I mean, think about the Silk Road, right? And like the whole history of ceramics in Europe, right, came from Asia. And so without the Silk Road and all this trade exchange of thoughts and ideas, Europe wouldn't have been Europe, right? And after the fall of Rome in the Middle Ages, like all of the scientific and kind of cultural advancements in Europe came through the Crusades from stealing it from the Middle East. So there's a much more complicated narrative out there, and a lot of people just don't want a complicated narrative. So it's in the 20th century that we start looking for a complex narrative and trying to complicate things, because it's never really quite as simple as people want it to be. All right, so formalism is important. It's, again, really nice to try to just distill it down to what it is, to what's on the canvas, because things can kind of spiral out, and the conversations are never ending when you start bringing different perspectives, different cultures, and different histories into the conversation about art. So formalist theories inspired various modernist movements such as Cubism, Constructivism, and Abstract Expressionism, which rejected traditional representational forms in favor of exploring the intrinsic properties of visual media. These movements sought to redefine art's purpose in a rapidly changing world, aligning with the formalist emphasis on innovation and pure aesthetics. So, yes, I'm just in going over this right now, I'm feeling like this is, formalism in a lot of ways is like this safety zone. It's a comfort zone, because you can control the variables. It's just what's on the picture plane, right? And things do get very complicated once you start looking past that. All right, so methodologies and practices in art history. So formal analysis, we've talked about this. This is like the whole class, right? We're looking at the visual elements of art, the line, the color, shape, texture, space, and composition. And we are trying to understand how these contribute to the overall meaning of the artwork and its effect on the viewer. Contextual analysis is going to look at the historical, social, political, and cultural context of art, including patronage, the artist's role, and the intended audience. Critical theories. So these are modern approaches that incorporate feminism, post-colonialism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis, addressing issues of power, identity, and representation within art. Again, this is really the next lecture, is critical theory. So now in the digital age, we have new challenges, right? So we've got these amazing resources, right? I can go online, I can get the highest resolution image just by Googling something, right? I can go into Google Arts and I believe GIS, that's different, but I'm thinking like Google Image Services. Anyways, I probably should have looked up what GIS mapping actually was when I put this whole thing together. But we can really we can scan a piece and we can understand, we can record the three-dimensionality. Remember that impasto word that we were talking about in the texture lecture? We can take a 3D scan of the surface of a work of art and know the depth of every single brushstroke on there. And we can use computers to isolate the exact color, right? Not just how the color is responding under the lights in which it's being presented, but the actual color based on the chemical analysis of a pigment in the work of art. We can also then extrapolate that information to understand what that color looked like when the artist actually put it on the canvas. And so we can reverse the aging of time. And a lot of the works that we have nowadays, they're varnished, they get cleaned and all that, but the pigments themselves degrade over time. And so we can recreate what the works actually looked like at the time they were created by using digital resources, by using computer, which is wild. Right? So we can actually travel through history, right? My master's was an online, my art history degree was online, and I was able to use virtual reality, like an Oculus headset, to pop onto the Google Wander to go to pretty much any museum in the world and go wander around through that museum like it was a Google Map thing. And it was actually high resolution enough that I could see the paintings as they existed on the wall and actually get a sense of scale. And it was almost good enough at the time, it might be now good enough that I can almost read the wall labels, right? So I can hop on. I'm like going from the Parthenon to the British Museum back and forth within 30 minutes. It's crazy. So anyways, technology actually is awesome. So yes, I kind of covered this, but technology has really enriched our understanding of art. Yeah, but also it raises new issues, right? Ethical and practical considerations. The digital age raises questions about authenticity and the experiential aspect of art. Simultaneously, it facilitates collaborative projects, blending art history with science and technology, right? We can do a lot more now. I was at an art fair a few years ago, and these people had taken 3D scans of Van Gogh paintings and then used a 3D printer to recreate them three-dimensionally, right? So it wasn't just a print on a flat piece of canvas. Like, it was printed with the exact same impasto and the exact same color as the artist. And they were selling these things for over $100,000, right? Which is a bargain when you know that Van Gogh, like the original, would be, up like 50, 150 million, depending on the piece. Like, yeah, you're looking at a fraction of the price, but still ridiculous and not real. And where's the boundary there? What's real? And even what I'm saying, being able to do like a virtual reality tour of a museum, like, that's fantastic, but is it a substitute for actually being there in person? I personally don't think so. I think that art paintings are real, right? And to truly experience the work of art and understand it, you have to be physically present with that piece. Picture is not going to cut it. Digital image is not going to cut it. But it's a start. All right. So now we are having debates about provenance, repatriation, cultural heritage. This is really important, right? Because again, that Indiana Jones thing, there was a lot of white dudes from the West going around the world taking artifacts and putting them in their European museums, right? And so now people are asking for their things back. And so there's this conversation of where do they belong? Is it the property of all of humanity? Should they be where the most people can see them, or should they be back with their original culture? Greece is an interesting case study on this, right? Because the modern Greece is very different from ancient Greece, right? And a lot of they were part of the Ottoman Empire for a while. And so the Parthenon, one of the most historically significant buildings, the sculpture that adorned the Parthenon was removed and taken to England, and it's in the British Museum. And so Greece, right, which is part of the EU, part of the European Union, has been asking for their stuff back. And the British Museum is kind of like, yeah, no, like, we bought it fair and square. Like, do you actually have the space to show it properly? And then in Greece and Athens, they're like, yeah, like, we built a whole museum and there's empty cases for it. But the British Museum, isn't giving it back, right? And that's just a very simple thing. We see it all the time in the Southwest, where there was a lot of really important native cultural artifacts that were collected by Americans, right, and are in private collections and museums. And a lot of these native people want their things back, right? And so these are intangible cultural properties. So just because it was purchased, should it have even been allowed to be purchased? Can they purchase it back? Is that even right? That seems a little wrong. So it's a really complicated conversation that is happening like everywhere on so many levels right now. And there's no answer. It's something to think about. So with that, art history is a dynamic discipline that explores the profound relationship between art and humanity. By examining visual culture through diverse lenses, art historians interpret the past and contribute to contemporary cultural discourse. Whether analyzing a Renaissance masterpiece or a digital installation, art history remains committed to uncovering the many layers of meaning embedded in art. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.